Against this backdrop, the MPC decided to reduce the policy rate by 25 basis points to 8% per annum with effect from the 20th of September. In discussing the stance, MPC members considered an unchanged stance, a 25 basis point cut, and a 50 basis point cut. The MPC ultimately reached consensus on 25 basis points, agreeing that a less restrictive stance was consistent with sustainably lower inflation over the medium term. The forecast sees rates moving towards neutral next year, stabilizing slightly above 7%. As before, the rate path from the quarterly projection model remains a broad policy guide, changing from meeting to meeting. Decisions of the MPC will continue to be data dependent and sensitive to the balance of risks to the outlook. There are scenarios where inflation could undershoot the baseline forecast if oil prices are lower or the exchange rate appreciates further. Conversely, inflation could be higher than our baseline forecast given scenarios such as higher housing costs, larger electricity price increases, or wage increases that outrun inflation and productivity growth. Meanwhile, food inflation is a source of uncertainty, despite recent improvements. Global conditions pose additional challenges. Geopolitical risks are heightened and could generate further economic shocks. Policy uncertainty is also elevated in various parts of the world. Both trade restrictions and debt levels are rising and might go much higher. This mix could add significant inflationary pressure to the world economy, generating tighter financial conditions for South Africa and other countries. For the time being, South African assets have performed relatively well. The rand has strengthened during the year more than most peer currencies, while long-term yields have moderated and spreads over US rates have narrowed. These moves have reversed some of the deterioration experienced since 2020. Given a potentially adverse external environment, however, it is crucial to sustain domestic reform momentum. This entails both structural reforms to support growth capacity and macroeconomic efforts to rebuild fiscal and monetary policy buffers. The MPC's main contribution is to deliver low and stable inflation with well-anchored inflation expectations. We also recommend additional measures that would improve economic conditions. These include reaching a prudent public debt level, further repairing and strengthening network industries, lowering administered price inflation, and keeping real wage growth in line with productivity gains. This concludes our statement, and at this stage, we would like to invite members of the media to raise questions, and members of the MPC would respond. Alistair.
Governor, thanks very much for taking our questions. Alistair Bull from Bloomberg. You said 25 and 50 as well as a hold were on the table. Could you give us a breakdown of the MPC vote so we can get a sense of how close a call it was between those three decisions? Thanks very much.
Kopan.
Afternoon, Governor and Deputy Governors. Kopan Ogumbi from Reuters. Similar to Alistair's question, I wonder if you'd characterize this 25 basis point cut as taking a cautious approach to the start of the cutting cycle. As you say, 50 was considered. Should we expect forthcoming rate cuts to be gradual or take a more quickened pace? And ultimately, what had you decide to not go 50? If we look at the charts, the output gap is a little more than a rounding error this time around. So was there no scope for a bigger cut? And if not, why not? And then lastly, has two-pot activity to date changed your views or assumptions on the inflationary impact or the effect on growth, or its effect on growth? Thanks.
Good afternoon, Governor, and the rest of the panel. My name is Ntando Tsukwana from Bloomberg News. Governor, just on your comments around the Rand and the fact that it has rallied, you have a baseline forecast of 18 Rand 04, and I'm just wondering how that affects your outlook for prices and further easing. And then my other question is on the differentials in the SARB's real rates and the US's real rate. Just at what level would you be comfortable for that gap to be? How much cushion would you need there to be? Thanks.
Okay, let's take those. You know, I was writing, I forgot to take your name. Ntando, thank you. Alistair and Kopano, the decision was unanimous. We reached consensus. So everything was on the table. There were views that said that hold. There were views that said we could move 25 basis points. And there were views that said that we could move 50 basis points. Our approach is risk-based. We assess the balance of risks to both inflation and to the growth outlook. And we exercise judgment. And in the analysis, we found 25 basis points to be a prudent stance to take. Central banks are very cautious across the world at the moment. And it has to do with the fact that there is so much uncertainty. There are so many moving variables. And as you would see in our forecast, we have revised our inflation forecast for the period. And whereas previously we thought that inflation would average 4.9% this year, we now think it would average 4.6%. But we are most of the time so focused on the most recent print. And I just want to re-emphasize, yesterday's inflation does not mean much for the policy outlook. What matters is what inflation would be in the future. But shall we look at trend? Over the past 5 years, you say on an annual average, the highest annual average was 2022, and it was 6.9. And it was consistent with inflation rising all over the world in 2022. But for South Africa, fortunately, we had started tightening policy in 2021. And so getting into 2022, we were able to peak earlier. Whilst we peaked earlier than the advanced economies and many other emerging market economies, the move downwards for South Africa was very sticky and was not a smooth one. There was a lot of excitement last year when we reached a rate of 4.7 that inflation is dead, only for it to rear its ugly head, and inflation started creeping up. And so 2022 peak 6.9, the peak last year again lower, and this year we are saying that we are going to average 4.6. So the trajectory can be seen. And so whereas there are a lot of moving parts, what cannot be taken away is that the policy stance we have taken had been the correct one. Forthcoming rate cuts, you are invited to the next MPC meeting. You will know what happens at that meeting. Was scope for a bigger cut, as I had said, we are risk-based. It all depends on the assessment of risks, what stance we would be taking. Inflationary pressure of the two-pot system, the impact of the two-pot system on either inflation or growth is built into our forecast. Not an easy one because we can't quite tell how much would be withdrawn. So we have got two scenarios, one being a high withdrawal scenario and a moderate drawing scenario. But even if you were to get that right, it depends on whether people channel that into consumption or they channel it into debt reduction. Of course, if they channel it into debt reduction, it offers consumers a lot more buying power almost on a permanent basis going forward because you would have retired the debt. It will be a different ball game if the consumers all just go and consume. And some of the narratives that has been coming had been that households are under pressure, under debt pressure. If they are under debt pressure, it doesn't make sense for the households to withdraw the money and then go and spend it. The correct thing to do would be to reduce the debt, and if you have repaid the debt, what that means is that the amount every month that you are paying towards debt repayment is now available for spending or for saving. Ntando, the rent has always been pointed out as one of the risks, and when we talked about the risk, we basically talked of a two-sided risk. And we are repeating that here. If the rent depreciates, it could lead to a higher inflation. If it appreciates, it might help to sustain the disinflationary momentum, mainly through the imported component of core inflation, and core inflation does reflect for us a preferred measure of underlying inflationary pressures. SAP's real rate relative gap relative to that of the US, always useful to look at that, but we are not targeting interest rates. We are targeting inflation. And the point of departure should be, what is the inflation differential between the US and South Africa? And for as long as our inflation is higher than that of the US, that means that there is a risk that our currency would depreciate at least by the inflation differential. But we are not targeting targeting the gap. But we set real, which also became an interesting one, because at yesterday's rates of the US, where they end up with 4.75 to 5%, if you use 5% for ease of calculation, that means the gap between the US and South Africa is 300 basis points in nominal terms. But it's a different ball game when you start to bring in inflation, because we have got higher inflation. But once again, you want to analyze that gap, look at what the future inflation trajectory would be and what are the risks attendant to that inflation trajectory, and it might give you a better idea of what the real interest rate gap between the US and South Africa is. What really drives flows to South Africa is not so much the gap between the policy rate of the US and the policy rate in South Africa. Is the differential between the South African government bond yield and the US treasuries, because the flows into South Africa are not coming through deposits in the banking system, but are coming mainly through the bond market. Next round of questions, please.
Balisa from CNBC Africa. Governor, I'm sure consumers will heave a sigh of relief and will appreciate having more money in their pockets. But many consumers, or should I say some consumers, Governor, believe that the SARB may have made a mistake by not cutting rates sooner. Is the MPC worried that it may be behind the curve?
Cindy Mabi from ENCA. Governor, similar to Palis, I wanted to find out if the decision by the MPC, and we understand that it is based on collated data, whether this is a financial or economical tipping point for South Africa in anticipation that, of course, in November, there'll be a further 21 basis points, if I'm not ahead of myself. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I ask? Yeah. Alex Winning, Reuters. Two questions. The first is about inflation expectations. You repeatedly, have noted at recent meetings that they're not yet at the midpoint. They're not yet at 4.5. Is that not a very high bar to reach, given that, when analysts and trade unions and business people, they're always going to be aware of concerns out there. So by setting a bar of saying that inflation expectations, we want them to actually fall to 5 itself. They fall to 4.8% recently over the next 2 years. Is that not shutting the door for bigger rate cuts? You're saying you'll only ever then move in small steps because you've got that very high threshold that on inflation expectations. And then the second question is about growth. The growth forecasts, I think, aren't greatly changed for this year and next year. There's it's the same for this year and it's slightly up for next year. But load shedding obviously has been suspended for now. Why isn't there a bigger bump in the growth forecast? Thank you.
There are people online. I hope they are journalists.
Yes, they are journalists. It's clear, Lesetja. Her question is, the MPC statement makes a point of stressing the risks to the outlook. As such, the tone of the statement comes across as hawkish and cautious. Despite the fact that the decision to cut was unanimous, would that be a fair assessment? And why have you chosen this particular tone? Are you trying to temper expectations that the terminal rate may be heading in a direction that takes it below the 7.25 neutral rate? Thank you, Governor.
Okay. Kopanos Row seems to be interested in further questions. I didn't say you, I said your row. I thought, oh, okay. Is that it in the room? Okay, thank you. Pali and Cindy, Pali and Cindy, your questions are very similar. Timing of the rate cut, are we behind the curve? No, we do not believe we are behind the curve. Neither do we believe that we should ever try to be ahead of the curve or be preemptive. We assess the balance of risks, and if we think that the risk profile is such that you have got to have a changed policy stance, that is what would drive us. Tipping point, we're not falling. We are not falling. And you say, as we had said in the statement, the policy rate path in the QPM is a policy guide that changes from meeting to meeting. So the quarterly projection model of the Reserve Bank is predicting another 25 basis points in November. But we do not follow the model mechanically, because if you followed the model mechanically, you don't need this team here. You could just employ the model and then decide on the basis of the model. But this team here applies its mind and, may I say, are very vigorous debaters, which is why you enter the room with people with 3 different views. And at the beginning of the meeting, you will almost sit there and say, are these chaps ever going to reach a decision? And the one thing about them is that they understand data. The one thing we do here to arrive at a decision, we beat the data until it confesses. And so we are data dependent in our decision making. Setting the bar too high for further rate cuts, Alex, you seem to suggest that the focus of a central bank is when and by how much to cut interest rates instead of deciding on what is the correct policy stance for the state of the economy we are in and the outlook for that economy. I think that the difference between us and what we have seen elsewhere in the developed world, where inflation was able to retreat so quickly, even if it peaked higher than ours, was that even when inflation was high in the US, in the UK, and in the Euro area, inflation expectations continued to be anchored at their target of 2%. That is why their disinflationary process was so much faster than ours, whereas in our case, we even had inflation expectations outside of the target range. Are we setting the bar too high? No. Well, if we say we are setting the bar too high, you are suggesting that the inflation target that we have is an incorrect one, because that is the policy anchor. And so we would expect inflation expectations to be anchored there, and we would want inflation to be there. And so inflation is lower than we expected at the previous meeting and at the beginning of the year. What this economy actually needs is not just lower inflation. We need low and sustained inflation. And that is what you would have to see. And that is why you will find in the statement we talk about, we think that there are good developments that suggest that the low inflation environment would be sustained over our forecast horizon. And that the balance of risk, the risks are assessed to be on balance for both growth and for inflation. But these things change all the time. If the balance of risks changes, the MPC have to reassess and make a decision on the basis of that. Why have we not seen a big bump in the growth forecast given the end of load shedding? Load shedding is not the only source of our growth problems. And what you will actually notice was that last year, at the beginning of the year, we thought that load shedding would take off a full 2% from growth. As the electricity situation improved, we reduced the impact that it would have, and it is now the impact below 0.2% in terms of the impact of load shedding. And for the outer 2 years, we actually think that it will be zero. So that is where we are. But there are also the logistics to sort out. We've got to sort out investment. So growth problems in South Africa has not just been about electricity. Electricity just happened to be the most visible one because it affects all of us. Clay, hawks, doves, owls. The statement is what it is. It reflects the assessment of the committee of the state of the global economy, the state of the South African economy, the risks to the inflation outlook and to growth. We have assessed both the growth outlook and the inflation outlook. We have assessed the risks to be balanced, and that is the thing. Are we being maybe then cautious? Well, you've got to be cautious. Adventurism is not part of our monetary policy toolkit. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes the proceedings of today.